has a long, rich, diverse tradition of philosophy and philosophical thought. And it spans at least 2.5 millennia. And it comprises of not just one religious tradition but many. So, religion in the context of philosophy, it's particularly significant in India. And this is where it is different from the Western philosophy, at least as we see it now. Because in India, it is believed that the role of philosophy or philosophizing, it is very much associated with one's personal destiny. And so the intellectual pursuit of an individual, you cannot set it aside from the inner or the spiritual quest. So what the Western people consider religion and philosophy, these two things are combined in India and Indian philosophical system. In fact, if you go back to the Greek philosophical schools, then you would find more similarities than the current ones that are there in the West. And of course, it's the recent development, philosophers and thinkers from Enlightenment era, somebody like Immanuel Kant, who separated God from what he thought could be learned about the nature of things by reasoning. So the philosophers like him, they drew a clear line between religion and philosophy. But that is not really the case in Indian philosophy. And in some ways, that is what makes it quite interesting actually. And that's what I'm going to talk about today. The very basics of Indian philosophy. Many people call it Hindu philosophy or Sanatana Dharma philosophy. But the reason to use the word Indian here is to understand it in the broader context, where you also have the Buddhist philosophy, the Jaina philosophy, and all those different schools of philosophy which originated in India. Once again, if we go back to the point of the difference between religion and philosophy, first thing we notice that in Western traditions there is this concept of God, and it's always there, whereas in Indian philosophy it doesn't have to be the case. In some schools there is this idea of God, in some there isn't. But the other important point is that both these things, religion and philosophy, they are very much concerned with the nature of reality. They want to explore this question of reality. So that's why there is no strict line between the two in Indian context. And especially when you consider the fact there may or may not be the idea of God, then there's hardly any line between the two. In that case, both are primarily through the teachings of certain teachers or philosophers, both are trying to philosophize on the idea of reality, what it is, and then the subsequent questions which confront us in philosophy. One of the other reasons that there is no such line here is because in the Abrahamic traditions there is this idea of revelation and a holy book, where there is the concept of God and the prophet, and magically you find one book appearing out of nowhere, and that's how you're drawing certain lessons. But in Indian traditions, even the religious scriptures, they were written over many generations, and you can argue surely that this happened with Bible and Quran also, and they were compiled after generations, but at least hypothetically that is not how it is claimed, and that affects. So if it is claimed that a particular book came directly from God, then you have little scope to improvise it. But on the other hand, if you come to the scriptures, the Vedas in Hinduism or any Buddhist texts, they have been constantly improvised. So that's really interesting here. And as we go into the different branches of philosophy, let's say we talk about metaphysics. So certain schools of Indian philosophy, they get into the metaphysics, and certain schools they don't. So Buddhism, for example, it deals with certain questions of reality. For example, the nature of human suffering, human emotions, but it doesn't go into metaphysics at all. So all these different schools of philosophy, or you can also call them religious schools, they attend certain questions and ignore certain others. So I'm mentioning these points because anybody who's coming from Western schools of philosophy or Western understanding of seeing a particular religion, they might find certain troubles here. And they might find that, for example, when we use the term Hinduism or Buddhism, they might find that it's not a monolithic tradition compared to the other isms that they follow. And there are so many multiplicities, contradictions within each philosophical school. So that is something one has to keep in mind. Another thing one has to keep in mind, that in Western philosophical tradition, the idea is to seek the truth. That is, you are constantly striving to find the truth through logic, through reason, through evidence, all these tools. However, in Indian schools, the highest goal is not really the truth, but the end of suffering, or moksha as it is sometimes called. So we're trying to minimize or end the suffering, all kind of suffering, whether physical, mental, spiritual, whichever way you look at it. So that is the highest goal. So eventually you'd find that since the goal is different, the method, the approach, it becomes a bit different too. For example, in Western traditions, you'd find that philosophy is purely an intellectual exercise. It's nothing more, nothing less. But in Indian traditions, philosophy, or darshana as it is called, it is practiced with a lot of other things. Certain rituals are there, certain yoga and meditation practices, they go with it, because the idea is to bring the whole identity, whole self into account, and not really identifying a very narrow picture of anything. And as per Indian schools, it cannot happen if you don't take into account all these factors. So it's much more comprehensive. It might feel a bit odd, a bit awkward to intellectuals, but that is how it is. So we have to understand the kind of framework that is there in this tradition. So if we continue along this line of thought, we find that another major difference that arises in these two philosophical schools is that of how they eventually discover things or how they find answers. So, since the Western tradition is more about finding answers, finding truth, you'll find a lot of argumentation there. You'll find a lot of equations and statements being drawn, and you come to these objective conclusions which are very much independent of the observer. But on the other hand, in Indian philosophical schools, you'll find that subjective element is always there. Because as you would find in the teachings of Buddha, he says the truth is what you experience it. So he does not give you a solution for your, let's say, any kind of suffering, for your mental suffering. He says you try it and you decide it whether it is true or not. If it doesn't fit in your experience, then it is not. So the subjectivity of truth comes here. And since truth is not really, the objective truth at least, is not the highest value here, then you find there is no need to attain that, and we just live with the idea of subjective truth and try to minimize the suffering. And of course, this leads to a lot of different things, different ideas. And in fact, even similar ideas, you will find different frameworks, and the entire arguments and line of questioning that changes in these two different schools. So if you are getting into philosophy, whether Indian philosophy or the Western philosophy, you need to consider these things. You need to consider the framework within which they operate, and should not use one lens to judge the another. And a lot of time people do make that mistake, and then they think that there are certain things lagging in the other one, but that's not really the case. One is exploring the truth, the world, with its own perspective and trying as hard as it can, and the other is also doing the same thing. So if you take this approach, it'll be much more interesting for you to explore these philosophical schools. And of course, we will get to the specifics, and we will talk about different philosophical ideas in these schools, and then it'll get much more interesting.